17 years of marriage. It sounds like a lifetime, doesn't it? Enough time to build trust so unshakable, it feels like it will weather any storm. That was the life I thought I had built, until I returned home one fateful day, utterly blindsided by betrayal. I had been working abroad for years, sacrificing time with my family to provide them with everything they could ever need. The hours were long, the distance agonizing, but I told myself it was all for a good cause. I envisioned my wife and 2 daughters living comfortably in a bigger house, their future secure, their happiness guaranteed. I trusted her, implicitly, to hold down the fort while I chased our dreams. My best friend since childhood, a man I had shared countless memories with, stepped in to help during my absence. When I saved up enough money for us to look for a new home, I suggested he assist my wife in searching for the perfect place. It made sense at the time. After all, he was practically family. I decided to surprise them. I wanted to see the joy on their faces when I returned unannounced, bearing news that all our sacrifices had paid off. I could already picture their smiles, the warm embrace of my daughters, the relief on my wife's face. But instead of joy, I was met with a letter that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. It wasn't a note left for me. It wasn't an invitation to share in her thoughts or an expression of longing for my return. No, it was a love letter. I stood there in stunned silence, rereading her handwriting, my hands trembling as the words burned themselves into my brain. It wasn't a casual flirtation or a misunderstanding. It was unmistakable. My wife and my best friend, 2 of the people I trusted most in this world, had been sharing a love that had no place in our lives. When I confronted her, her face betrayed everything. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to explain. And when I turned to my best friend for an explanation, his silence confirmed the worst. They had crossed the line and both knew they were caught. I demanded answers. How long? Why? How could they? But no explanation could dull the sharp sting of betrayal. I had been away, toiling for their happiness, while they played house behind my back. Every hour I had spent working, every dollar I had sent home, it suddenly felt meaningless. I lashed out in anger and pain, not physically but emotionally. I told my best friend that we were done. I couldn't look at him without remembering how he'd stolen something sacred from me. Before severing ties, I made him pay back every cent I had ever lent him. It wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming the respect and dignity he had stripped from me. With my wife, it was more complicated. I couldn't simply walk away, though every instinct screamed at me to do so. As I looked at her, I saw not just the woman who had betrayed me, but also the woman who had once stood by my side through thick and thin. I saw the mother of my children, the woman who had sacrificed for our family, who had held my hand through my darkest moments. And as much as I hated it, I saw the loneliness in her eyes, the pain she carried in my absence. She didn't try to justify her actions, but she spoke of the emptiness that had consumed her while I was away. She talked about how it had started with small conversations, innocent at first, and how it had snowballed into something she couldn't stop. I wanted to scream that it was no excuse. I wanted to tell her that loneliness was no justification for ripping our family apart. But even as the anger boiled in my chest, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still loved her. The part that remembered the years we had spent building this life together. I stood there in our home, the silence between us deafening. I had always believed that betrayal would be the end of any marriage, the unbreakable deal-breaker. Yet here I was, unable to take the final step and leave. My daughters were upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm raging below. I thought of them, of the life they deserved, of how much I had sacrificed to keep our family intact. Could I really take that away from them? Could I let my anger and heartbreak destroy the family we had built? My wife begged for a chance to make things right. She promised me it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness. She swore it would never happen again. I wanted to believe her, but I wasn't sure I could. In that moment, I realized my decision wasn't just about us. It was about our daughters. It was about the life we had built and the future we still had ahead of us. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, but I also didn't know if I could let go. I stayed. Staying was not an act of forgiveness. Not at first. It was an act of survival, for me, for my daughters, for the remnants of a family that had been cracked but not yet shattered. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Every moment I spent in that house felt like walking on broken glass, the edges of betrayal cutting into me every time I looked at her. She tried. I will give her that. She tried everything to make amends. She apologized endlessly, though her words often felt hollow. She cried when she thought I wasn't looking, and sometimes even when she knew I was. She went out of her way to make life easier for me, cooking my favorite meals, cleaning up after the children, and doing things that she hadn't done in years. But none of it could erase the image of that letter from my mind. I wanted to punish her. I wanted to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had caused me. But every time I opened my mouth to lash out, I saw the fear in her eyes. Fear that I would leave, fear that our daughters would hate her, fear that she had destroyed everything we had built. And so I swallowed my anger, letting it fester inside me like a poison. Our daughters, blissfully unaware of what had happened, became the glue that held us together. Their laughter, their school projects, their teenage dramas. These were the distractions that kept me from falling apart. I couldn't bring myself to take away their stability, to upend their lives because of something they had no control over. And so I stayed, for them as much as for myself. But staying came at a cost. Trust, once broken, is not easily mended. I found myself questioning everything she said, every move she made. If she came home late from the grocery store, I wondered if she had met someone. If her phone buzzed, I felt a pang of paranoia. It was exhausting, living in a state of constant suspicion, but I couldn't help myself. She knew it too. She could see it in the way I looked at her, in the way I hesitated before answering her questions, in the way I avoided her touch. She never complained, though. She accepted it as her penance, a burden she would have to bear if she wanted to keep our family intact. We sought counseling. It was her idea, and I agreed reluctantly. I didn't think a stranger could fix what had been broken, but I was willing to try for the sake of our daughters. The sessions were uncomfortable, forcing us to confront emotions we had buried deep. The therapist asked questions that made my stomach churn, questions about love, trust, and forgiveness. I hated every minute of it, but I kept going. Through it all, there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, where I saw glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with. Moments when her laughter filled the room, or when she looked at me with a softness that made my chest ache. These moments gave me hope, though I was too afraid to admit it. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a single act. It is a process, a journey that takes time and effort. And though I wasn't there yet, I found myself taking small steps in that direction. Not for her, but for me, because carrying the weight of anger and resentment was slowly destroying me, and I knew I couldn't live like that forever. As the weeks stretched into months, life took on a strange rhythm. On the surface, we looked like any other family trying to navigate the chaos of everyday life. But beneath the surface, a quiet tension lingered, threatening to pull us under at any moment. There were days when I felt almost normal, days when I could smile at her without forcing it, when the sound of her voice didn't immediately trigger memories of betrayal. But those days were rare. More often than not, I found myself replaying the events in my mind, dissecting every detail, searching for answers that would never come. And then there were the nights. It always hit me hardest at night, when the house was quiet and my thoughts were loud. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that confrontation. The way her face crumpled when I confronted her. The way he refused to meet my eyes. The way my daughters hugged me that night, completely unaware that their father was breaking inside. One night, unable to sleep, I got up and wandered into the living room. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. I sank into the couch, my mind churning with restless thoughts. I opened my laptop, more out of habit than anything else, and started scrolling through old photos. There we were, smiling on vacations, celebrating birthdays, living a life that now felt like someone else's. I stopped on a photo of the four of us from our last family trip before everything fell apart. We looked so happy, so complete. I wondered if it had all been a lie. And then, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a figure in the background. My best friend. I'd forgotten he'd joined us on that trip. Seeing him there, so close to my family, sent a fresh wave of anger crashing over me. How long had it been going on? How many moments like this had I missed? I closed the laptop and leaned back, my mind racing. I needed answers. Not for her and not for him. For me. I needed to understand how my life had unraveled so completely without me even noticing. And so I began to dig. I went through old messages, emails, anything that might give me a clearer picture of what had happened. Felt invasive, wrong even, but I couldn't stop myself. I was desperate for clarity, for some semblance of control in a situation that had stripped me of it entirely. What I found was both infuriating and heartbreaking. Messages that started off innocently enough, but gradually became more personal, more intimate. Inside jokes that I wasn't a part of. Plans made without me. And then the ones that left no room for doubt. Messages that confirmed everything I already knew but had hoped wasn't true. I sat there in the dark, the evidence laid out before me, and felt a strange sense of calm. It was as if, in seeing the full extent of their betrayal, I'd finally reached the end of the maze. There were no more questions, no more room for doubt. Just the cold, hard truth. The next morning, I confronted her again. This time, it wasn't about accusations or blame. It was about clarity. I showed her what I'd found and asked her to fill in the blanks. To her credit, she didn't deny it. She didn't try to justify it, either. She just sat there, tears streaming down her face, and answered my questions as best she could. It didn't make it hurt any less. But it gave me something I hadn't had before, closure. Or at least the beginnings of it. The days blended into weeks, and the weeks blurred into months. Life became a balancing act between normalcy and chaos. A tightrope walk where the slightest misstep threatened to send everything crumbling down. On the surface, I held it together. I went to work, came home, and played the part of the husband and father as if nothing had changed. But the cracks beneath the surface were widening, and I could feel myself slipping. My wife, for her part, was relentless in her efforts to repair the damage. She'd cook elaborate meals, leaving little notes of apology hidden in my pockets or on my desk. She'd arrange family outings and date nights, hoping to reignite a spark that had long since burned out. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the way she clung to hope like a lifeline. But no matter how hard she tried, the weight of her betrayal loomed over us like a storm cloud, dark and unrelenting. At first, I tolerated her efforts in silence. But the more she pushed, the more her gestures began to feel like an insult. A futile attempt to plaster over a wound that refused to heal. One evening, after another carefully planned dinner, I snapped. "Do you think this fixes it?" I said, pushing my plate away. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't stop. "Do you really think a nice meal or a romantic gesture erases what you did?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But it was quickly swallowed by the tidal wave of anger I'd been suppressing for months. "I'm trying," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm doing everything I can to make it right. But it's not right." I stood up, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You broke us. You and him. You shattered everything we built. And now you expect me to pretend it never happened." She didn't answer, just stared at me with tears streaming down her face. The silence hung heavy between us, filled with all the things we couldn't say. It was the first real fight we'd had since I decided to stay, and it left me shaken. That night, I slept in the guest room, unable to bear the thought of being near her. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I realized something. The anger I felt wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about my own failure to confront it, to make sense of it. I had been so focused on maintaining a facade of stability for my daughters that I hadn't allowed myself to grieve. The next morning, I made a decision. If I was going to move forward, whether that meant rebuilding our marriage or walking away, I needed answers. Real answers. Not the half-truths and vague explanations she had given me before, but the raw, unfiltered reality of what had happened. I needed to know the full scope of their betrayal, no matter how much it hurt. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, I sat her down in the living room. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I need you to tell me everything," I said, my voice steady but firm. "No more lies, no more omissions. I need the truth, every detail." She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said finally. "It'll only hurt you more." "Hurt me more?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Do you really think there's anything left to hurt? Just tell me the truth." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. And what she told me shattered what little resolve I had left. Her affair, it turned out, had started much earlier than I had suspected. It wasn't just a moment of weakness, as she had initially claimed, but a slow, insidious erosion of boundaries. It began with texts, casual, friendly banter that gradually became something more. From there, it escalated to secret meetings, stolen moments of intimacy that became harder and harder to hide. "He made me feel seen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were gone so much, and I was lonely. He listened to me in a way you didn't." Her words cut like a knife, but I forced myself to listen. She spoke of the guilt she felt, the way she tried to end it but always found herself drawn back to him. She talked about how he'd convinced her that what they had was special, that it was worth the risk. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What about our family? Was that worth the risk?" "I wasn't thinking clearly," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was selfish and I made a terrible mistake. But I never stopped loving you. I never stopped loving our family." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that her remorse was genuine, that she was as broken by this as I was. But the more she spoke, the more I realized how far we had drifted from each other, how blind I had been to the cracks that had formed in our marriage long before her betrayal. When she finished, we sat in silence, the weight of her confession pressing down on us like a heavy fog. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Instead, I got up and left the room, needing space to process what I had just heard. As I lay in bed that night, my mind raced with questions. Was there anything left to salvage? Could I ever truly forgive her? Or had her betrayal been the final nail in the coffin of our marriage? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. The path forward wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. Whether we stayed together or went our separate ways, the scars of her betrayal would linger, a permanent reminder of the storm we had weathered. Her confession hung over us like a storm cloud, the air between us thick with unspoken words. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying her every word, dissecting the moments she described, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. But the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. How could she have kept it from me for so long? How had I not seen the signs? Doubt began to creep in, not just about her, but about myself. I had always considered myself a perceptive man, someone who could read between the lines. Yet here I was, blindsided by a betrayal that had been unfolding right under my nose. What else had I missed? What other truths had I been too blind or too naive to see? One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind wandering down darker and darker paths, I realized I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. For months, I had been carrying the weight of her betrayal alone, too ashamed to share it with anyone. But the burden had become too heavy, and I knew I needed an outlet. The next morning, I called my brother. We hadn't spoken much since the affair came to light, mostly because I hadn't known how to explain the situation without breaking down. But as soon as he picked up, I felt a flood of relief. "I need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," he replied, his tone instantly serious. "What's going on?" I told him everything. The affair, the lies, the confrontation. It all spilled out in a rush of words I couldn't hold back. To his credit, he didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He just listened, his quiet presence on the other end of the line a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. When I finally finished, there was a long pause. "I'm so sorry, man," he said finally. I can't imagine how hard this must be for you. But what are you going to do? I don't know, I admitted. Some days, I think I can forgive her. Other days, I want to walk away and never look back. Well, whatever you decide, just know I've got your back. You don't have to go through this alone. His words were a small comfort, but they didn't erase the gnawing uncertainty in my chest. Still, it felt good to finally say the words out loud, to let someone else shoulder even a fraction of the burden. The weeks that followed were a blur of emotional highs and crushing lows. There were moments when I felt like we were making progress, like the pieces of our broken marriage were slowly being glued back together. And then there were moments when I couldn't even look at her, when the thought of her betrayal sent me spiraling into anger and despair. It didn't help that reminders of her affair seemed to be everywhere. The photos of us with my former best friend, the inside jokes that now felt like cruel mockery, even the little details she let slip in her confession. They all served as constant, painful reminders of what had been lost. But the worst reminders weren't the physical ones. They were the moments of silence, the tension that lingered between us in the quiet hours of the night. Every time we sat across from each other at the dinner table, every time our hands brushed accidentally, every time I saw her struggling to hold back tears, I was reminded of the chasm that had opened between us. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Part of it was my daughters. They were still blissfully unaware of the storm that had engulfed their parents, and I couldn't bear the thought of shattering their world. But part of it was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put into words. I still loved her. It was a painful, complicated love, one that was tangled up in anger, betrayal, and grief. But it was there, a stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished no matter how much I tried to snuff it out. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room nursing a glass of whiskey, I found myself staring at our wedding photo. Her smile, so bright and full of promise, felt like a cruel joke now. And yet, as I traced the lines of her face with my eyes, I felt a pang of longing for the life we used to have. I didn't know if we could ever get back to that place. But I knew I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. It was around this time that I started noticing strange behavior from her. Little things, like the way she'd quickly close her laptop when I entered the room or the way she'd glance at her phone with a look of guilt. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, a side effect of the lingering mistrust I couldn't seem to shake. But as the days went on, the feeling grew stronger. One night, after she went to bed, I found myself standing in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her sleep. She looked peaceful, her face free of the tension that had become so familiar in recent months. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we really could move past this. Maybe the worst was behind us. But then her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I froze, my eyes darting to the glowing screen. A message preview flashed across the display, but before I could make out the words, the screen went dark again. My heart began to race as a wave of suspicion washed over me. Was I imagining things? Or was there something she wasn't telling me? I knew I shouldn't look. I knew it was an invasion of her privacy, a line I had sworn not to cross. But in that moment, I couldn't help myself. I picked up the phone. My hands trembled as I held her phone, the weight of the decision to invade her privacy pressing heavily on me. The screen remained dark in my palm, a gateway to answers I wasn't sure I was ready to face. For a moment, I considered putting it back, walking away, and pretending I hadn't seen anything. But the doubt, the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right, refused to be silenced. I unlocked it. There wasn't much to see at first, just the usual notifications. An email, a weather alert, a news update. And then I saw it. A message from a contact saved under an innocuous name, Jesse. The preview read, "Miss you too. Can we meet soon?" My stomach dropped. I opened the conversation. Most of the messages were short, vague, and coded, nothing overtly incriminating. But the context was enough. There was no doubt in my mind that Jessie wasn't a friend or coworker. The tone, the timing, the very fact that she'd hidden it from me, it all screamed betrayal. Again, I scrolled back through the thread, piecing together fragments of their communication. It wasn't just the messages that hurt. It was the familiarity, the ease with which she seemed to fall back into this behavior. It was as if nothing had changed, as if all her promises of remorse and rebuilding were just hollow words. My chest tightened as anger surged through me. How could she do this to me again? After everything, after the pain and the forgiveness, how could she betray me so effortlessly? The next morning, I confronted her. I waited until the girls were at school, ensuring we'd have privacy. She was in the kitchen, her back to me as she poured herself a cup of coffee. For a moment I hesitated. The weight of what I was about to do felt crushing. But then I thought of the messages, of the lies, of the way she had looked me in the eyes and sworn she would never hurt me again. "Who's Jessie?" I asked, my voice cold and steady. She froze, the coffee pot hovering mid-air. Slowly, she turned to face me, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. "What? You heard me?" I said, holding up her phone. "Who is Jessie?" Her face went pale. For a moment, she didn't speak, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "It's not what you think," she said finally, her voice shaking. "Don't lie to me," I snapped, slamming the phone down on the counter. "I read the messages. I know what's going on." She flinched at my tone, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not an affair," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear." "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because it sure as hell doesn't look innocent. It's someone I met in a support group," she admitted, her voice trembling. "For people who've struggled with infidelity. I started going after everything happened. I needed someone to talk to, someone who understood what I was going through." Her explanation caught me off guard. "A support group?" I repeated, the anger in my chest faltering. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't think you'd understand," she said, wiping at her tears. "I didn't want to hurt you more than I already have. I've been trying to fix things to be better. For you, for the girls. But it's been so hard, and I didn't know how to talk to you about it. I didn't know what to say." Part of me wanted to believe her, to trust that this support group was as innocent as she claimed. But another part of me, the part that had been burned before, refused to let go of the suspicion. The messages were too personal, too intimate to be entirely platonic. "Why does it feel like you're hiding something?" I asked, my voice softer now but still edged with doubt. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "Because I didn't want you to think I was ungrateful," she said quietly. "You gave me another chance, and I know I don't deserve it. But I've been so scared of losing you, of messing up again, that I turned to someone else instead of facing my fears head-on." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that she was telling the truth. But trust, once broken, doesn't come easily. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with conflicting emotions. Her explanation seemed plausible, even genuine. But the scars of her first betrayal made it impossible for me to accept her words at face value. I needed proof, something concrete to confirm whether or not she was being honest. The next day, I made a decision. If she truly had nothing to hide, then she wouldn't mind if I attended one of these support group meetings with her. It would be a chance to see for myself what she had been up to determine whether her actions were as innocent as she claimed. When I brought it up that evening, she hesitated. "I don't know if that's a good idea," she said, avoiding my gaze. "Why not?" I asked. "If it's just a support group, what's the harm in me coming along?" She didn't have an answer. Instead, she nodded reluctantly, agreeing to let me accompany her to the next meeting. But the look in her eyes told me she wasn't as confident as she tried to appear. And so, a few days later, I found myself sitting in a circle of strangers, listening to stories of heartbreak, betrayal, and redemption. At first, everything seemed above board. The people were kind, the atmosphere supportive. But as the meeting went on, I began to notice things, little details that didn't sit right. The way she avoided eye contact with certain people. The way Jessie seemed to linger near her. Their interactions tinged with a familiarity that felt too personal. By the time we left, I had more questions than answers. The ride home from the meeting was steeped in silence. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as my mind replayed everything I'd seen. Jesse had been there, friendly, almost too friendly. The way they exchanged glances, the subtle touches that weren't quite innocent. It left a sour taste in my mouth. She stared out the passenger side window, avoiding conversation, as though she could sense the storm brewing within me. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation for what I'd witnessed, but I held back. I needed to process it first to figure out what my next move would be. When we finally pulled into the driveway, she lingered in the car, her hand hovering over the door handle. "Are you upset?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Should I be?" I countered, my tone sharp enough to make her flinch. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. I thought going to the meeting would help you see that I'm trying." I didn't respond, letting the weight of my silence do the talking. She sighed, opening the door and stepping out into the cool night air. I followed, my mind still racing as I watched her walk ahead of me into the house. Once the door closed behind us, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Jessie," I said, the name falling from my lips like a challenge. She froze mid-step, her back to me. Slowly, she turned, her face pale. "What about him? What's going on between you two?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw genuine shock in her expression. "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. "I told you, he's just someone I met at the group." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I saw the way you two were together. That wasn't just some casual acquaintance. There's something else, isn't there?" Her lip quivered, and she looked down at her hands. "It's not what you think," she said finally. "Jesse's complicated." "Complicated," I echoed, my anger simmering just below the surface. "What the hell does that mean?" She hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. "He's been through a lot," she said quietly. "His wife cheated on him too, and he's been struggling to move on. We connected over that." I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Connected? Not like that," she said quickly, her eyes pleading with me to believe her. "It's not romantic. It's just, we understand each other. That's all." Her words rang hollow, and I felt my stomach twist with doubt. "Do you think I'm stupid?" I asked, my voice laced with bitterness. "Do you think I can't see what's happening here?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to fix this, but you keep pushing me away. Jesse is just someone I can talk to when I feel like I can't talk to you." Her confession hit me like a slap in the face. "You can't talk to me?" I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. "After everything you've done, after everything I've forgiven, you still don't think you can talk to me?" "It's not that simple," she said, her tears falling freely now. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore. Every time I try, it feels like you're waiting for me to mess up, like you're looking for a reason to hate me." Her words stung, but I refused to let her see the cracks in my armor. "Maybe I am," I admitted, my voice cold. "Maybe I'm waiting because I know you're hiding something, and I'm tired of pretending like everything's fine when it's not." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands as I stood there, unmoving. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that we could still fix this, but the anger and hurt swirling inside me wouldn't let me. Instead, I turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the living room. That night I couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in my mind, intertwining with my own doubts and fears. Was I pushing her away? Was I so consumed by my anger that I was blind to her efforts to make things right? Or was she playing me for a fool, using my forgiveness as a shield while she continued to betray me? I needed answers, real answers, and I was done waiting for her to give them to me. The next day, I reached out to a private investigator. It felt like a betrayal of my own, but I didn't see another option. If she wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. A week later, the investigator called with his report. My heart raced as I listened to him recount his findings. Each word a hammer blow to the fragile foundation of trust one had tried to rebuild. She had been meeting Jesse outside of the group. Coffee shops, parks, even his house. There was no physical evidence of an affair. No photos of them kissing, no proof of intimacy. But the closeness, the secrecy was undeniable. When I confronted her that evening, I didn't give her a chance to explain. I laid the photos on the table, each one a testament to her deceit. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. Her eyes widened as she stared at the images, her face pale. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice trembling. "Then tell me," I said, leaning closer. "Tell me what the hell it is, because I'm done giving you the benefit of the doubt." She stared at the photos laid out on the table, her face pale, her hands trembling. For a long moment, she said nothing, her silence as damning as any confession. I could see the gears turning in her head, the desperate search for an explanation that wouldn't sound like another lie. But there was no escaping it now. "You've been meeting him," I said, my voice low but sharp. "At his house, cafes, in parks. And you expect me to believe this is innocent?" "It is," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I swear it is. I know how it looks, but it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded, my patience fraying. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me. Again." Her tears spilled over, but I wasn't moved. I'd seen this performance before. The tears, the apologies, the pleas for forgiveness. And every time it felt a little less sincere. "It's not an affair," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to hide it from you, but I was scared. Scared of how you'd react." "Scared," I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You're scared of me, but not of sneaking around behind my back? Do you hear yourself right now?" "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to make things worse." "Worse?" I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. "You don't think lying to me, meeting him in secret, makes things worse? Do you even hear yourself?" She flinched at the sound, her tears falling faster now. But I didn't stop. The dam had finally broken, and all the anger, all the pain I'd been holding back for months, came pouring out. "I gave you another chance," I said, my voice rising. "I stayed. I forgave you. I put my own pain aside for the sake of our family. And this is how you repay me? By sneaking around with him?" "It's not like that," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, you have to believe me." "I don't have to do anything," I said coldly. "I've given you every opportunity to prove yourself, and all you've done is lie. So tell me the truth. Right here, right now. What is this?" She stared at me, her face crumpling as she struggled to find the words. It's complicated," she said finally. "Complicated," I repeated, my voice dripping with contempt. "That's your excuse? Complicated." Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands. "I don't know how to explain it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to go this far." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Go this far," I said, my voice trembling. "So you admit it. You admit that there's something going on." "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know what it is. I feel so lost. And Jessie understands me in a way that—" Her voice trailed off, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew exactly what she was going to say. "In a way that I don't," I said bitterly. She didn't deny it. I stood there for a moment, staring at her as the weight of her words settled over me. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like I was free falling into a void with no end in sight. "You have no idea what you've done, do you?" I said finally, my voice quiet but laced with anger. "No idea how much you've hurt me, how much you've destroyed." "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I've hurt you, and I hate myself for it, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix us." Her words were like salt in a wound, a painful reminder of how far we had fallen. For months, I had clung to the hope that we could rebuild what we had lost, that we could find our way back to each other. But now that hope felt like a cruel joke. "You can't fix this," I said, my voice breaking. "You can't fix us. You've made sure of that." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging between us like a thick fog. She looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. Finally, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the kitchen. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room for another second. That night, I packed a bag. As I folded clothes into the suitcase, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly questioning, constantly doubting, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. When she saw the suitcase, her face crumpled. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I need space," I said simply. "I can't do this anymore." "Please," she said, stepping closer. "Don't go. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." "I've heard that before," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "And look where it got us." She reached out to grab my arm, but I pulled away. "I need to go," I said firmly. "For me. For my sanity." And with that, I walked out the door, leaving her behind. Walking out of that house felt like breaking free from a cage I didn't realize I'd been trapped in. The moment I stepped into the cool night air, a weight lifted from my chest, a brief, fleeting reprieve from the suffocating tension that had consumed my life for months. But as I drove away, suitcase in the back seat and no destination in mind, the relief quickly gave way to something darker. I felt lost, untethered. For 17 years, that house had been my anchor, my safe harbor. Even in the worst of times, it had always been home. But now, it was tainted, every room filled with the echoes of betrayal. I couldn't go back, not yet, maybe not ever. I found myself at my brother's doorstep, standing in the cold with my suitcase in hand. When he opened the door, he didn't ask any questions. He just pulled me into a hug, a simple gesture that nearly broke me. "You're staying here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I nodded, grateful for his support. He led me inside, offered me a drink, and sat with me in silence until I was ready to talk. The first few days at my brother's house were a blur. I went through the motions, barely speaking, barely eating. My thoughts were a constant whirlwind, memories of happier times clashing with the reality of what my life had become. I wanted to shut it all out, to escape from the pain and confusion, but there was no escaping my own mind. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart raced. I knew it was her. I hadn't blocked her number, but I hadn't responded to her messages either. They came like clockwork. Apologies, please, promises. She begged me to come home, to talk, to give her another chance. But I couldn't bring myself to reply. One evening, my brother sat down next to me, a beer in his hand and a concerned look on his face. "You can't avoid her forever," he said gently. "I'm not avoiding her," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. "You're running," he said, his tone firm but kind. "And I get it. But at some point, you're going to have to face this. Whether you decide to forgive her or walk away for good, you need to make a choice. You can't stay in limbo forever." His words stayed with me long after he left the room. He was right, I couldn't keep running. But the thought of confronting her, of opening myself up to more pain, was almost too much to bear. A week passed before I finally responded to her messages. "We need to talk," I wrote, my fingers trembling as I typed. Her reply came almost immediately. "Please, come home. We can work this out. I love you." I didn't respond. Instead, I told her I would meet her at a nearby cafe the following evening. Neutral ground. Somewhere public, where emotions wouldn't run as high. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her face pale. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. I sat down across from her, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. "Thank you for meeting me," she said finally, her voice trembling. I nodded, waiting for her to speak. "I've been a mess since you left," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. For lying. For sneaking around. For breaking your trust." Her words hit me like a wave, but I stayed silent, letting her continue. "I know I've ruined everything," she said, her voice cracking. "But I love you. I love our family. And I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Just tell me what to do, and I'll do it." Her desperation was palpable, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy. But it was quickly overshadowed by the anger and hurt that still burned in my chest. "I don't know if this can be fixed," I said finally, my voice low. "You've broken something in me. Something I don't know how to repair." She reached across the table, her hand trembling as it rested on mine. "Please," she whispered, "don't give up on us." I pulled my hand away, the gesture sending a clear message. "I've already given you more chances than you deserve," I said, my tone sharp. "And every time you've let me down. How am I supposed to believe that this time will be any different?" Her tears came harder now, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. "Because I'll prove it to you," she said, her voice barely audible. "Whatever it takes, I'll prove it." I stood up, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. "Maybe you can," I said, "but I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. And without forgiveness, what's the point?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. "Please," she said again, "please don't walk away." But I did. That night, I lay awake in my brother's guest room, staring at the ceiling as her words replayed in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that we could rebuild what we had lost. But another part of me, the part that had been broken by her betrayal, knew the truth. Some things can't be fixed, and maybe it was time to stop trying. It's strange how quiet the world feels after a storm. In the days that followed my decision to walk away from her at that cafe, I felt like I was living in a vacuum. The anger, the heartbreak, the endless cycle of questions and doubts. All of it had been so loud for so long that its absence was almost deafening. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive. It was the silence of endings. She didn't contact me after that night. Maybe she finally realized that there was nothing left to say, or maybe she needed time to process what had happened. Either way, her absence only deepened the void I felt. For so many years, she had been a part of my life. A constant, even in her betrayal. Letting her go felt like losing a piece of myself. But it also felt like freedom. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a future without her. It wasn't an easy thing to do. Every plan I had ever made, every dream I had ever chased, had included her. Now I was starting over, building a new life from the ground up. One morning, I found myself sitting on the porch of my brother's house, a cup of coffee in hand and the sun rising in the distance. The world felt still, like it was holding its breath. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sliver of clarity. I thought about my daughters. They still didn't know the full extent of what had happened, and I wasn't sure how to tell them. I didn't want to paint their mother as the villain, but I also didn't want to lie to them. They deserved the truth, at least as much of it as they could handle. Later that day, I called them. I kept the conversation light, asking about school and their friends, but I could hear the worry in their voices. They knew something was wrong, even if they didn't know what. "When are you coming home, Dad?" my youngest asked, her voice small and uncertain. I hesitated, my chest tightening. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said honestly, "but I promise I'll see you soon." It wasn't the answer she wanted, and I hated myself for not being able to give her more. But I knew I couldn't go back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. As the weeks turned into months, I started to rebuild. It wasn't easy. Some days, the weight of everything threatened to crush me. Other days, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could come out of this stronger. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and challenges to keep my mind occupied. I started going to the gym, channeling my anger and frustration into something productive. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again. but the scars remained. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal overnight. Even as I started to move forward, I found myself questioning everyone around me, second-guessing their motives and intentions. It wasn't fair, but it was my reality. One day, out of the blue, I received an email from her. The subject line was simple: "I'm sorry." I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the mouse. Part of me didn't want to open it, didn't want to reopen the wound I had worked so hard to close. But curiosity got the better of me and I clicked. Her message was short but heartfelt. She apologized again for everything she had done, for the pain she had caused, for the trust she had broken. She said she understood why I had walked away and that she didn't blame me for not forgiving her. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she wrote, "but I hope one day you can find peace. And I hope you know that I will always love you, no matter what." I closed the email without replying. Months later, I found myself sitting in a new house, a modest but comfortable place I had rented to start fresh. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but it felt like mine. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control over my life. I thought about her often, about us, about the life we had built and the life we had lost. There was a time when I couldn't imagine living without her, when the thought of letting her go seemed impossible. But now I realized that some endings were necessary. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing the good times or pretending they didn't exist. It meant accepting the past for what it was and choosing to move forward anyway. I still didn't know what the future held. But as I sat there in the quiet of my new home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not for reconciliation, not for a return to what once was, but for the possibility of something new. Something better. And for now, that was enough. The end.